portion of the program is two presentations by two distinguished Puerto Rican personalities. Maria de Lourdes Santiago, member of the Puerto Rican Senate and former candidate for governor, represented the Puerto Rican Pro-Independence Party. And Rafael Bernabe, like somebody say my long-lost brother, but not really. Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, and former candidate for governor, representing the Puerto Rican Working People's Party. They are going to address their talks on the title of the conference, Puerto Rico, Savage Neoliberalism, Colonialism, and Financial Despotism. The two moderators are the two professors that have been in the organizing committee for this event, Professor Roberto Alejandro from Political Science, and Agustin Laó-Montes from Sociology. I leave you with them.
Welcome to all of you to this important event. My colleague Agustin Laó told me that because he spoke at the beginning of the conference at 1:30, and then he also spoke here during the panels, that I had that honoring the American principle of fairness, I was under the obligation of delivering some remarks by way of introduction. So I'm going to oblige, even though I don't have any intention of competing with my colleague Agustin Laó. Historically speaking, Puerto Rico is a very young nation. And it is clear that our history has been aggravated by our conditions, subjectivities through colonial domination. But since it is almost impossible to envision power without resistance, there are important exceptions represented by movements and persons who have been able to challenge and withstand the onslaught of imperial designs and construct identities to support alternative views of reality. This conference is honored to have vibrant embodiments of the new subjectivities that reflection and political action make possible. Today, right now, Puerto Rico is enduring and living through what is probably its darkest hour in the last 70 years. The transparency of the savagery of neoliberal policies is almost blinding. For more than 2 decades, and for me this is deeply discomforting and disturbing because we in Puerto Rico tend to mobilize when pensions are cut or when salaries are reduced. But for me there are other problems that are probably deeper, and apparently they don't mobilize the sensibility of citizens on the island. For more than 2 decades now, the island has been a killing field for young adults.
Yes.
With 700, 800, and even 900 murders on an annual basis. Even during the time of El Rosellato, and the governor was bailing La Macarena, and thousands of people were dying. We haven't seen a massive march of citizens showing at least a sensibility toward these victims. For more than 2 decades now, more than 1 million people depend directly on a federal program of nutritional assistance under the symbolic name of PAN, which is one of the rallying cries of the Popular Democratic Party in Puerto Rico. PAN means a Programa de Asistencia Nutricional. And you know what the meaning of PAN is in Spanish. So basically one of the rallying cries of the colonial architect of the colonial establishment now is a federal program. While young Puerto Ricans have died by the thousands, other thousands have gone to the airport and become part of a large diaspora. And today we were very honored to have Manuel Albelo, the son of a dear friend of mine, Edgardo Albelo, to talk very eloquently about the prospects and all the potentialities embedded in the Puerto Rican diaspora. This disheartening landscape has a bright point. The colonial status was dying for many years and kept dying. With the formal imposition of the Federal Financial Board, La Junta, Washington officially certified the demise of its creation. Today, a guy by the name Jeff Sessions, from a state that allegedly is part of the Union, from Alabama, wants the colonial establishment to apply makeup to this dead and rotting body and to include it as one of the options for the plebiscite in June. For those of you who have been paying attention to the news, Jeff Sessions said that the rotting corpse of el Estado Libre Asociado, the mummified reality of colonialism, should be represented, should be dragged in the middle of the day and be part of the plebiscite options. So we have a juridical death and an economic death. This is aggravated by the profound impoverishment of the analytical categories of capitalism in general and of neoliberal policies in particular. Capitalism glorifies pluralism and diversity. But in the economic domain, this is what the British call rubbish. And the Americans, always more efficient in language, refers to by using only 2 letters. In reality, neoliberalism has one recipe, and only one, that it applies with consistent indifference to the particularities of the countries it seeks to victimize. From Brazil to Argentina, from Greece to Puerto Rico, it is always the same prescription. Privatization, removal of regulation, austerity, punishing policies against workers' organizations, which are described as labor costs. And then the exclusion of political deliberations. The universal formula that is summoned to treat economic problems is joined to the claim that experts, not citizens, should be the only voices, and that economic and financial debacles are technical issues that are located outside the arena of democratic deliberations. This is just a technical issue. Only the experts are allowed to discuss it. For our last panel, we had 2 living and robust testimonies of the new Puerto Rico that is alive and well. We have Professor Rafael Bernabe, Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Puerto Rico, and Maria de Lourdes Santiago, both militants with moral backbones, symbols of resistance and dignity. My colleague Agustin Laó will present Professor Bernabe. Let me say a few words about Maria de Lourdes. Maria de Lourdes Santiago is one of the most distinguished political leaders on the political scene in Puerto Rico today. In this moment of poor erosion of public schools, it is worth mentioning that she's the product of public education. She went to public school in her hometown, Ajunta, and then moved to complete a bachelor degree in drama before turning her attention to law. All her degrees in higher education are from the University of Puerto Rico at the main campus in Rio Piedras. She's very young, but when she was still younger, she began her political militancy in the pro-independence Puerto Rican party, where through her merits and hard work, she rose to become vice president. In the early 2000s, she participated in acts of civil disobedience against the presence of the American Navy in Vieques. The federal authorities were not pleased, and she spent 1 month in federal prison on the island. He has served 2 terms as senator, and this past November he ran for the position of governor in representation of the pre-independence party. Personally, I feel that to be a senator in Puerto Rico surrounded by the non-entities requires a special portion of stamina. She's the first woman to be candidate for governor in representation of the pre-independence option in Puerto Rico. Maria de Lourdes has demonstrated a consistent trajectory on behalf of education and on behalf of the environment and against colonialism. It is a pleasure to have both Professor Rafael Bernabe and Maria de Lourdes with us today. It is also my pleasure to introduce Maria de Lourdes to you.
Muy buenas tardes. I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation to this conference and to this panel, the panel of politicians. Y gracias a Roberto por la gentileza de tu palabra. Many years ago, when I began in politics, I read somewhere that politics is, or should be, the art of transforming reality. But too often, politics acts as a sophisticated parlor trick to hide or to distort reality. Puerto Rico is a textbook example of this less noble undertaking of politics. And I would like to speak today how the crisis we are currently facing is an urgent call to accept our reality, that of a Latin American and Caribbean nation made by colonialism, and also the reality of the United States as a country that in 2017 still exerts its imperial power over a nation that has unmistakably repudiated the existing territorial relation. July 25th marks the Catholic festivity of Santiago Apostol, an important part of our Spanish heritage, now a minor folkloric celebration. It was on 1898, the date selected for the invasion of Puerto Rico, an invasion that served no military purpose, as the outcome of the Spanish-American War was already decided. But it was of utmost importance for the budding empire to make a grand entrance to the territory so intensely coveted for its geopolitical value. Weeks before, Theodore Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary to the Navy, had written to his friend and collaborator, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, "Do not make peace until we get Puerto Rico." Lodge's reply, "Puerto Rico is not forgotten and we mean to have it." Thus began the colonial experiment of United States in Puerto Rico, which eventually led to our islands being paraded as the showcase for American democracy, hiding under the disguise of benevolent intervention, a rapacious policy of political dominance and economic disposition. The American promise, as proclaimed by General Miles 4 days after the invasion, was, quote, "to bring you protection, not only to yourselves but to your property, to promote your prosperity, and to give the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization." That's the military version of white man's burden. Well, to put it mildly, that promise has not been fulfilled. After 119 years under American rule, Puerto Rico holds the highest rate of inequality under American flag, according to the Gini coefficient. and the lowest rate of participation in the workforce, a mere 40% of the population. About 20% of the home mortgages in Puerto Rico are in risk of foreclosure. Petitions for bankruptcy and levels of personal indebtedness have been both in the rise for years. No wonder then that 250,000 people have left the islands in the last decade, leaving an aging and impoverished nation. The unpayable public debt is estimated in $72 billion. Public inefficient monopolies of essential services are responsible for most of the debt increase. That would be PREPA, the Power Out Company, and PRASA, la AAA, Water and Sewage Administration. Teachers in public schools must do without textbooks or materials in crowded rooms in which almost 39% of the students are registered in the special education program. 300 schools will be closed in the following years. Pension funds for public employees will run out by 2019. Health services are in peril, not only for lack of funds, but for the exodus of hundreds of healthcare professionals fleeing to the United States to escape the unregulated dictatorship of health plans. How did this happen is nowadays a frequent question. The answer is very simple. The crisis is the only possible and clearly foreseeable result of colonial rule. What we are suffering, and the world is witnessing, is the failure of the colonial experiment of the United States in Puerto Rico. One of the first measures imposed by the US and the beginning of the myth of common currency was the devaluation in of the Spanish peso, and instant decapitalization by decree that paved the way for the acquisition of great extensions of land by American corporations, and the development of the sugar and tobacco industries dominated by absenteeism and sustained by inhumane labor conditions. Reality turned out to be was that the United States, as declared by Pedro Albizu Campos, founder of the modern pro-independence movement, was interested in the cage, not the birds. But these conditions brought two undesirable elements to the colonial experiment. First, the kind of discontent that brought sympathy to Albizu's preaching about the connection between the economic oppression and the political regime. And second, they inhibited the development of a healthy market for United States products. You cannot have New York prices with underdeveloped salaries. Around that time began the definitive drafting of the script to be followed in the staging of the colonial drama, that alternative reality in which we are still waiting. The economic support of the territory as an accepted cost of doing business and as an effective way of masquerading the impossibility of economic development in a system of political inferiority. That's the price of an empire. There was an increase in salaries, forced in part by the strike led by Albizu Campos, but something else happened. By 1934, 35% of the population received some kind of benefit from the Puerto Rico Emergency Reconstruction Administration, la legendaria PRERA. ¿Se acuerdan cuando nos decían, oye, ¿usted cree que esta es la PRERA que vienes a pedir? Next year, its complement and soon-to-be successor, the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration, the PRA, was administering a $50 million annual budget when the annual budget administered by the Puerto Rican legislature was only $9 million. Federal assistance became the real ruler in Puerto Rico. This is a pivotal point because at that time began the masterful mythification of colonial subordination, a new stage of the colonial experiment, that of social material pacification. The instinctive need of our people, of every people on earth, for freedom, independence, self-sufficiency, was obliterated by the satisfaction of the most urgent material needs so efficiently provided by the American government. Any opposition to the myth of colonialism as the only way to achieve social justice would be deemed an attack on the hand that was feeding the country. Not by coincidence, this was also the beginning of the era of the cruelest repression of the independentista movement, and also of the implementation of a thoroughly designed colonial identity, the inception of a collective sense of inferiority, the nurturing of individual dependence on economic assistance from the United States government, the copy and paste of American institutions, and of course, in 1952, the birth of the Frankensteinian child of colonialism, the Estado Libre Asociado, deceitfully translated as Commonwealth. The leader of the Partido Popular, Luis Muñoz Marín, aptly characterized by Pablo Neruda as the minion of the American whiskey, chofer del whisky americano, became then the key figure for the transfiguration of every colonial vice into a national virtue. To understand Puerto Rico, for those here who are not Puerto Ricans, you must bear in mind that colonialism operates as a psychological ambush. It's the collective expression of the Stockholm Syndrome. Or, if you will, think of it as the Matrix, you know, Keanu Reeves. where humans are victims of a computer simulation designed to fool their minds into believing that they are living a full life, when in reality they are in prison, their bodies used as a source for energy for their captors, and the small minority that resists is haunted by agents wearing dark glasses. The stage was also set for the making of Puerto Rico an ideal laboratory for neoliberal practices long before the term became fashionable. It can be said that for the young empire, the Caribbean colony was conceived as a shrine to the trilogy of evil that gives its name to this conference: savage neoliberalism, colonialism, and financial despotism. And here I would like to point out that the use of our land and our people as subjects for experimentation goes far beyond the metaphorical. Thousands of Puerto Rican women were sterilized without their consent as a population control method. Agent Orange was tested in a Yunque rainforest. The island municipalities of Vieques and Culebra endured for 60 years the bombardment with live ordnance by the US Navy, and today, corporations like Bayer Monsanto, Pioneer, Dow, and Syngenta benefit from the concession of generous extensions of public land and even more generous incentives, $520 million in less than a decade, for their experiment with genetically modified organisms. These incentives actually are one of the decades-old neoliberal practices whose failings are clearly documented but still remain unaddressed, and that reach its highest point with the tax-sparing arrangements for capital-intensive U.S. companies provided by Section 936 of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code, the poster child of neoliberalism acting in a colonial context. Not only it proved to be a perfect vessel for the unequal distribution of social responsibilities, but it also provided an abnormally fertile ground for the pharmaceutical companies that were its main beneficiaries, thus provoking one of the principal vulnerabilities of the colonial economic system. 70% of all exports in Puerto Rico belong to the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. Neoliberal policies acted in close connection to one another, and then again being Puerto Rico a colony, with the prioritization of the interests of the American capital. Thus, the wealth generated by Section 936 not only failed to jumpstart economic development, but actually helped generate some of the conditions related in one way or another to the present crisis. For example, the unwise investments in construction, aided by too willing to lend mortgage banks, banks that profited from 936 deposits, elements that ushered the increase in price of real estate. The inevitable fall of the construction industry was then cushioned by a succession of incentives for the acquisition of homes and the building of hotels. Because that's the real business in Puerto Rico. It's not operating a hotel, it's building the hotel. Aimed at the socialization of the private sector losses. This is one of the ways in which the colonial government has willingly played the role of a confused Robin Hood, stealing from the poor to give to the rich. Puerto Rico has been led to believe that there is no life worth living outside the protection of the American flag. That's the colonial matrix. The reality is that the more Puerto Rico has adhered to the rules dictated by the United States, the worse its situation has been, and that's something to reflect about now that we're under the reign of the Fiscal Control Board. These are the numbers. In 1970, federal transfers equaled 7% of the gross national product, and that year, real economic growth reached 7%. Fast forward 45 years, 2015, and the same transfers had rocketed to 24.4% of the gross national product. The rate of economic growth, negative 0.6%. And even during the heyday of Section 936, on the 70s began the unstoppable fall. Economic growth had declined to 2% in the 80s. Still, during the same period, capital yields remitted to the exterior went from 593 million, that's 1970, to almost $36,000 million last year. But as a result of a completely dysfunctional tax system, tax revenues fell from 10.1 to 8.3, a completely abnormal buoyancy rate. What is a country to do in such a dire situation? If that country is a colony, there isn't much to do. Bankruptcy law is preempted by the federal government. That means we have no power whatsoever to restructure our debt or debt of our public corporations and municipalities. Neither can we request international financial aid. And that's not the worst part because, and this is really important, the debt is nothing but a symptom of the real malaise, the impossibility of economic growth under a system of political inferiority. There's nothing we can do under American rule to put a stop to the known, to the acknowledged drivers of economic decline. We are bounded by the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, which makes it illegal for us the adoption of any protectionist measures to counter, for example, the adverse effects in the local economy of megastores or of the tariff imposed in raw materials needed by local manufacturers. The imposition of the United States cabotage laws forced us to depend on the expensive United States merchant marine for the transportation of consumer goods coming from any point in the US. That means that a country in which 45% of the people are under the level of poverty is forced to subsidize a completely outdated shipping policy whose benefits, even to the United States, are seriously questioned. In a world economy woven around international agreements, we cannot enter in any agreement with any other nation without express US approval, even when privileged access to US markets, arguably one of the highlights of our colonial relationship, was lost a long time ago. Even environmental matters, you all have heard about Peñuelas, like the current controversy about the disposition of coal ashes, is subject not only to insufficient federal standards, but to overt extralegislative congressional intervention in the defense of American economic interests. It must be clear to everyone that economic development is nothing but a pretension incompatible with colonial reality, as the independentistas have warned for decades. Still, the United States to the crisis could not have been more myopic and ill-directed, applying to a crisis created by colonialism the highest possible dose of colonialism, la Junta de Contrafiscal. 7 US government-appointed persons with absolute power over my country, including veto power. We are, legally and politically speaking, worse off than a century ago, when the Chamber of Delegates, then the only elected members of the government, actually had a say in government matters. Paradoxically, in order to lay the legal grounds for the imposition of the Fiscal Control Board, the US government had to lay out in the open the true nature of the territorial relation a couple of hours before the debate on Promesa began on the House of Representatives, and that's no coincidence. The United States Supreme Court issued its judgment in the case of Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle, concurring with Obama's administration's stance. It was held that the powers exercised by the government of Puerto Rico exist and can only be exercised as delegated by Congress, which is in all governmental matters the ultimate source of power. It was Congress who conferred the authority to create the Puerto Rico Constitution, stated the court, and even more important, quote, "One power Congress does not have, just in the nature of things, the capacity, no magic wand or airbrush, to erase or otherwise rewrite its own foundational role in conferring political authority," end of quote. This is the dismantlement of the idea of present or future sovereignty under the territorial status. Someone has to tell Jeff Sessions. For saying things like this, the independentista movement has been penalized, persecuted. Now, Sanchez Valle has made it acceptable to say in polite company that the emperor is naked and he is such an ugly sight. Now, the board is doing exactly what Professor Bernabe and I repeated and repeated and repeated as candidates for governor. Extract from our country whatever is left in order to appease the American creditors, including the Vulture Fund, that knowingly acquire triple exempt bonds from a government in clear route to insolvency. Because you can rest assured that if the only ones dealing with Puerto Rico's default were small Puerto Rican investors or Puerto Rican cooperatives, the Fiscal Control Board would have never come to existence. The measures imposed by the Control Board have already encountered strong resistance. Women took the streets on March 8th. Students of the University of Puerto Rico are currently on strike with an unprecedented approval. Even the government has had to perform the good cop, bad cop sketch in its public relation with the board in order to maintain some credibility. But Puerto Rico has reached the point of no return, and the current situation can be summed up as this. First, the United States, through its creative statesmanship, devised a colonial system unique in some way, but like every colonial system, unable to thrive. Puerto Rico is broke because that was the only possible outcome of United States colonial policy. Second, after 119 years of American colonialism, we are not American and we don't want to be Americans. For more on this, #Rubio. Third, the loss of our military geopolitical importance, the disappearance of tax-sparing arrangements, and the collapse of the bond market have greatly diminished Puerto Rico's appeal to the United States. Fourth, 54% of the voters demanded in the 2012 referendum the end of the territorial condition of Puerto Rico. 5, the public debt is not difficult to pay. The public debt is unpayable. It is unpayable. And the austerity measures to be imposed by the junta will only accelerate what has been called a humanitarian crisis, but even more. they will have a long-lasting effect in the possibility of economic recovery. 6. By depicting independence as the recipe for isolation and poverty, and by fostering dependence through personal and corporate welfare, the United States has promoted the growth of the annexation movement. In the Partido Independentista, we used to call the era el semillero de estadista, and might eventually face a statehood petition driven by the widespread notion that statehood represents an endless cornucopia of federal funds. 7. Although there is a clear consensus about the convenience of having the tools for economic development that can only be provided by sovereignty, like not being bound by cabotage laws or the interstate commerce clause, a fair offer of sovereignty is needed to make this option palatable to most people. And last, the lack of resolution of Puerto Rico's status prevents the undertaking of any coherent strategy, even to tackle minor issues, as political forces are and will be defined by status preferences, which prevents any other kind of political alignment in the arena. On June 11th, there will be a plebiscite in Puerto Rico. The ballot reflects the two options for the U.S. to dispose of its territory. Well, I wrote this before. As Roberto said, Jeff Sessions issued a statement. Apparently, well, we don't know, we don't have his own statement. These are the tweeters by Rosello's tweeters that say that the government will oppose the intervention of the Department of Justice. We'll see to that. But right now, the ballot reflects the two options for the U.S. to dispose of its territory. First, integration as part of the U.S. Federation, or, that's the second option, the circle, a sovereign nation as part of a free association treaty with the United States or as an independent state. For us independentistas, it represents the fulfillment of Albizu Campos' prophecy. Llegará el momento de la suprema definición, o yanquis o puertorriqueños. The moment will come for the supreme definitions, Yankees or Puerto Ricans. Should the option for sovereignty prevail, a referendum will take place in October between the options of free association or independence. Should the option of statehood win, the time will come for the United States to decide whether to annex a Caribbean nation with a distinct national identity, a different language, and an indefatigable independentista movement. This is the moment for the United States to rethink its policy regarding Puerto Rico. This is the moment when politics should be an instrument to change the colonial reality that is a burden to my country and a shame for this one. It is for me a shocking fact, a truly shocking fact, that in the United States, even those considered liberals or progressive remain heedless to the outrageous persistence of colonialism in Puerto Rico. We remain a colony because the United States remains unabashedly an empire. The problem of Puerto Rico's political future is not a civil rights problem. It is a matter of collective self-determination. And the inaction of the United States will only aggravate an already critical situation. We don't need privileges. We don't want the crumbs that fall from the table. No more white man's burden. What we want is a new relation that honors the dignity, identity, and interests of two neighboring nations. An amicable separation, a mutual consent divorce, a fair transition. I have no doubt whatsoever that soon the force of our nationality and the need to reshape the political and economic structures that have brought us to the present crossroads will prevail, and we shall have our future in our hands. Only then will Puerto Rican reality change for the best. Muchas gracias.
Fiesta boricua, defiende lo tuyo.
That's right.
Well, it's a hard act to follow the sharpness, the charisma, the leadership provided by your words. So my role here is to present Rafael Bernabe. But before doing so, I just want to say a couple of things. One is that I would like to recognize the role of Caroline Parker and the crew of people who has been working on this. I mean, the people behind the scenes which really make this possible. And you know, we want to give a hand to Caroline Parker. I also want to say that it's a pleasure to work with Roberto Alejandro, who, you know, is a legend in the Puerto Rican scene. I mean, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's now is the president of the Puerto Rican, of the American Sociological Association, Puerto Rican. When he came here and I said that Roberto was a professor here, he said, please tell Roberto to come say hello to me, because, you know, his leadership of a strike that was national in 1981, that proved that student politics can become national politics in Puerto Rico is something that is alive in Puerto Rican memory. And, you know, from being a leader in the island and the diaspora, you know, Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, I actually remember during that time I was active in the diaspora in support of the strike. He's become one of the most prominent political theorists, critical political theorists in the United States, and it's really a pleasure to work with him in organizing this and many of the things that are coming. I was, you know, thinking when Maria de Lourdes was speaking, and the late Frank Bonilla, Beyond Survival, ¿por qué seguiremos siendo puertorriqueños? And I was thinking through the conference that had more than fulfilled our expectations of engaging these issues in a critical way, in a creative way, of Maurice Bishop when he was Prime Minister of Grenada, who said, you know, a very famous phrase of Maurice Bishop, who said that when in the United States they have a cold, we get pneumonia in the Caribbean. And, you know, this is really a symptom of what's happening in the island of a global crisis. And this is one which have a long history. And this is, you know, part of what we have been discussing here. But in the island of Puerto Rico, in the archipelago of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican communities here in the United States, it's really a colonial crisis, a societal crisis, and it's a collapse of the colonial state. And, you know, we are then in a very critical historical moment where, you know, we collectively as a people have the possibility of constructing something new. And it's a moment in which the most vulnerable people, working class, women, people of color, black people, arts, are facing most of the suffering from what are the consequences of crisis. So it's a moment of resistance and of possibilities of creating alternative futures. And this is what we are discussing here clearly. And in that note, I mean, and this panel, we put it together not to talk about politicos in the traditional sense, but to have the wide kind of variety of what the Puerto Rican left in terms of political parties represented here. And, you know, one of the main voices in Puerto Rico for many years in the Puerto Rican left has been Rafael Bernabe, which, you know, I'm proud that we graduated from the same PhD program, which is, you know, the Binghamton program. And I remember Teddy Hopkins being Teddy Hopkins, you know, is the one that we remember there. But he's not as known as Emmanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Enrique, you know, the great figures of the sociology program where we graduated. But Teddy, you know, who was actually the mastermind behind it, as Wallace and Arrighi say, was very proud that there is a crew of Puerto Ricans who graduated from there. You know, Juan Yuti, Pancho Mocoso, and you know, of us Puerto Ricans who graduated from there, the one who really have arrived, not only as an important intellectual voice, because he has the book that is more well known in English is Puerto Rico in the American Century History since 1898, but Rafael Bernabe had published several books, many of which have been interventions, political interventions in very important moments, and as part of Taller de Formación Política has done work which has actually been intervening in the intellectual, political, public sphere for many years. The one who has become more of a public intellectual, radical public intellectual, has been Rafael Bernabe. I mean, remembering the Huelga de la Telefónica, the strike that was mentioned in 1998. He was the national voice then. He has been in the Vieques struggle, in many struggles, and has been the main leader of a really important political formation, which is the Puerto Rican Workers' Party, el Partido de los Trabajadores Puertorriqueños, which actually is not simply a workers' party in the traditional sense, but is actually a more coalitional workers' party like the PT in Brazil, the Workers' Party in Brazil, that it puts together a variety of ecological, feminist, anti-racist, community struggles, etc. So it's really a pleasure to have here Rafael Bernabe, who is intellectual of many different talents, and who is one of our main leaders, our main voices in the Puerto Rican left. Please welcome Rafael Bernabe.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches. I begin by thanking Agustin for these words and by thanking the organizers of this activity for inviting me and for making possible my presence here today. There are many, before I start, we have some copies of the presentation I'm going to read, so you may follow it as I read it. I wasn't sure my English was going to work as well as it did when I lived in the US many years ago. They are, let me wait till people get it so we can follow it. I can start by saying a few introductory remarks. The main one is that, of course, I'm not going to be able to address many aspects of the situation in Puerto Rico in my presentation, given the amount of time I have. I would be more than happy to address them in the discussion period if you want to. And as I said, in order to honor the time I have, I'm going to read the presentation so that I don't speak too much. So let me start. Isolating the situation in Puerto Rico is one of the mechanisms used to seek acceptance of the austerity policies that are now being imposed on the island. If the crisis, as some people argue, is the result of actions by Puerto Ricans or the Puerto Rican government, if the responsibility lies exclusively or fundamentally in Puerto Rico, then it is only fair that it bears the consequences of its own deeds or misdeeds, painful as they may be. To recognize that the crisis of indebtedness is a global phenomenon, that the debate over fiscal crisis and austerity policies spans the planet, suggests, on the contrary, that the crisis in Puerto Rico, with all its colonial particularities, is in fact not unique. This also suggests that the crisis has structural, systemic roots linked to the contradictions of the dominant economic order in its present stage. It cannot be attributed to some specifically Puerto Rican pathology. From this, two conclusions may follow. One, just as austerity policies are resisted elsewhere, we should not acquiesce to them in Puerto Rico. And two, we need to connect with the resistances elsewhere, including, of course, the United States. In this presentation, I examine the current debates in Puerto Rico using two concepts. The two concepts are punitive neoliberalism, and the second one is financial melancholia. I will explain what that means in a minute. Elaborated by several students of similar debates in Great Britain. I begin with some very general comments on two issues, unemployment and debt. Unemployment is a normal aspect of capitalism. During its recurrent recessions and depressions, unemployment increases above normal levels. In colonial and underdeveloped economies, such as Puerto Rico, unemployment is typically much higher, not only periodically, but chronically. In response to this reality, the reality of unemployment, and often thanks to labor and social reform movements, many governments, including the United States, have instituted programs that lessen the privations provoked by the lack of employment in a market economy. Nevertheless, we are all aware of the popularity of the notion that unemployment results from the fact that, quote, people don't want to work, and that welfare, that is to say, programs that compensate for no or low income, promote and reward laziness. According to this logic, the problem is laziness, not capitalism or colonial capitalism. The problem is the poor, not the system that impoverishes them. Welfare is the problem, not the system that does not generate employment. It would be hard to exaggerate the reach of this ideology that exonerates capitalism while blaming others, indeed blaming some of its victims for its consequences. This misrepresentation of reality is perfectly fitted for the reproduction of the existing social system, has penetrated all social sectors. Something similar happens in the case of debt, or over-indebtedness, and fiscal crisis. To put it very briefly, in its present epoch, capitalism cannot exist without very high levels of debt. For example, capital seeks to lower its tax burden and to freeze or cut real wages, yet it must increase its sales to individuals and to the state. The bridge between these two contradictory impulses is built on debt. Meanwhile, deregulation frees speculation with debt-based financial instruments that some of the previous speakers spoke about this, which eventually led, among other things, to the great financial meltdown of 2008, at which point governments organized massive bailouts of their banking and financial sectors, for which they incurred new massive debts. This is the real source of the present fiscal crisis, globally speaking. Not excessive spending or overgenerous social programs, but 3 decades of corporate tax cuts, not fiscal excesses, but the cost of rescuing capital from its speculative irresponsibility and excesses. Yet, personal over-indebtedness is not attributed, when we hear people talking, is not attributed to the dominant economic system, but to individual negligence. The system is not the problem, but rather individuals who have irresponsibly, as we often hear, lived beyond their means. Similarly, the fiscal crisis is blamed on excessive spending, high public sector wages, over-generous social programs, or subsidies. Capital is again exonerated. The source of the crisis is the irresponsibility of individuals or of government, not these policies imposed by capital over 3 decades. All of this has practical consequences. If welfare and a bloated public sector are considered to be the causes of unemployment and of the fiscal and debt crisis, then the solution must then consist of welfare and public spending cuts. This may be painful, we are told, but it is inevitable. Yet there is a discordant fact in all of this, a very discordant fact, which is that austerity policies do not function as promised. In country after country, they have had a depressive impact. They worsen the economic crisis that they are supposed to solve. Thus, justifying them in spite of their manifest failure requires turning the economic debate into a moral drama. Perhaps, we are told, perhaps austerity policies do not function as well as expected, but they are morally deserved. Austerity is the deserved, if bitter, consequence of our irresponsibility. William Davies thus speaks of a third stage of neoliberalism, which he calls punitive neoliberalism, which is characterized by the justification of austerity policies as punishment, a deserved punishment of past excesses that must be administered regardless of other considerations. It's not so much now that these policies are efficient. Even they are even willing to admit that they are not as efficient as they are supposed to be. But nevertheless, we must impose them, because otherwise the whole moral order of our society would collapse. From this punitive perspective, to protest against austerity, as many of us insist on doing, seems particularly perverse. Such protests perpetuate, according to this perspective, they perpetuate the very same irresponsible behavior that lies at the root of the crisis, affirming the infantile desire to live whichever way without facing the consequences. Furthermore, if the fiscal and debt crisis is the result of the irresponsible actions of government or politicians, or both, then it must be concluded that both the electorate and the representatives are part of the problem. They can hardly be expected to lead in the solution if left without proper guidance. Hence, an authority above the electoral pressures is needed to impose the required discipline. Thus, from its inception, neoliberalism demands a reduced democratic accountability as it shifts key policy decisions to unelected bodies. For example, shifting important policy decisions to central banks that nobody elects, and they act independently of who is in government at any particular moment. And this is often done and justified in the name of depoliticizing decisions, of creating non-party or non-partisan or technocratic institutions, or placing decisions in the hands of professionals or so-called experts. Now, everything I have said applies to Puerto Rico in a very clear way. None of this refers to Puerto Rico in particular. This is neoliberalism in general. But all of this applies very clearly to Puerto Rico. I already referred to the widespread notion of chronic unemployment as a result of the purported laziness and of the demoralizing impact of welfare. Regarding debt, it's no different. Public debt, we are told, is the consequence of fiscal excess, government overspending, or government over-expansion. The phrase normally used in Puerto Rico is gigantismo gubernamental. We have a gigantic government. Individually and collectively, we have lived beyond our means. But the unavoidable day of reckoning, we're told, is upon us. And this is the logic that is to be found in editorials, opinion columns, radio and TV programs, policy papers and interventions in public hearings, and so on. Phrases such as the party is over, because we had a big party and now the party is over. The mirage that we tried to inhabit has now dissolved. The false glitz covering our misery has dissolved, and so on. Readjustment will be painful, but it's deserved. To protest is unrealistic, irresponsible, and infantile. Davies and other researchers have also studied what they call financial melancholia. It's an interesting concept, which briefly put is something that they describe as afflicting persons, individuals, that internalize the guilt for their situation of over-indebtedness, who blame themselves for it in spite of evidence that speaks to the contrary, and who feel that they deserve punishment for this debt that they have incurred. And needless to say, this is the mindset that best corresponds to an attitude of acceptance towards the policies of austerity, typical of punitive neoliberalism. And this is the mentality, this is the idea, again, that is incessantly promoted by editorialists, columnists, commentators and analysts in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, this comes with an additional twist. As mentioned above, Puerto Rico is usually portrayed as isolated from the global crisis. It is as if Puerto Rico were the only place undergoing a fiscal and debt crisis. What allegedly we face is not a particular case of a global crisis, but a strictly Puerto Rican disaster, rooted in the incapacity of Puerto Ricans to adequately manage their own affairs. This specifically Puerto Rican pathology that lies at the root of the crisis justifies or would justify that an external agent, such as the Federal Fiscal Control Board, be put in charge of rectifying Puerto Rico's financial practices. In our case then, the general neoliberal explanation of the debt crisis as the result of personal or public irresponsibility and of austerity enforced by non-elected, undemocratic bodies as the necessary corrective, both draws upon and reaffirms the colonial notions of native, in this case Puerto Rican, inadequacy for self-government that long predated the crisis. This is not new, but this is reaffirmed by the crisis, and also is the solution of the crisis through anti-democratic means is nurtured by it. But we know, as I said before, that austerity policies have an unjust and counterproductive impact. Just to give one fact, economist Sergio Marx-Swatch, who is not a particularly radical or leftist analyst, calculated that the budget cuts adopted by Governor Rosselló in collaboration with the Federal Control Board will depress Puerto Rico's GNP by at least 6.5%. This is the least depression. It could be much higher. Now, my final section, resistance to all of this. The struggle against punitive neoliberalism and its ideology begins with the rejection of its myth. One, unemployment is not the result of laziness, but an aspect of capitalism, and even more so of colonial and dependent capitalism. Two, debt and over-indebtedness are not caused by personal irresponsibility or over-generous public spending. They are inherent to capitalism, particularly in its most recent period, with its anti-labor policies, corporate tax cuts, and bailouts. Three, people and states owe capital because capital owes all of society. In Puerto Rico, this manifests itself in a particular paradox, which is a stagnant economy with a bankrupt government still generates massive profits for a handful of mainly US corporations. Four, the fiscal and debt crisis is not a Puerto Rican particularity, but part of a much global process. Five, austerity is not inevitable. It is the policy that global capital seeks to impose to make us pay for its crisis. Six, to the extent to which it is imposed, austerity is imposed, is not preordained, but rather depends on the outcome of the clash or the series of clashes between its promoters and the resistance to it. In Puerto Rico, the prevailing orthodoxy repeats over and over that since austerity and neoliberal policies have been adopted globally, we cannot do otherwise. This discourse is deployed everywhere. Everybody, everywhere is told that since such policies are dominant elsewhere, they must be adopted everywhere. To break the chain of global neoliberalism, ultimately an international task, we need two things. First, nobody, anywhere, no people, can afford or should wait for others to resist or struggle. If we all wait for others to act elsewhere, then nobody will act anywhere. If we all wait for a more favorable international situation, then the international situation will remain unfavorable. We must act wherever we are, even when initially isolated, if such is the case. Second, we must understand that nobody, no people, can succeed on their own. We cannot wait for anybody to initiate the struggle, yes, but we must count on others and must immediately seek to link our struggle with resistance elsewhere, beginning in our case with the struggles in the United States. Puerto Rico today urgently needs, one, a program of economic reconstruction, two, the political powers necessary to carry out that program, three, a movement capable of formulating and pressuring for that plan and of demanding and attaining those powers, and four, international allies without which no alternative to the dictates of capital can succeed. In other texts, I have summarized some of the key aspects of Puerto Rican society under US rule. Allow me to restate 6 of them very rapidly. First, since 1900, Puerto Rico's economy has been shaped by the priorities and preferences of US capital. It has been and remains a classically dependent colonial economy. Secondly, while specializing the production for export largely controlled by US capital, the island has imported most of the consumer goods needed for its reproduction. An example of this one-sidedness is the destruction of Puerto Rico's agriculture. Third, a further consequence of the domination of US capital has been the outflow of a significant portion of the income generated in Puerto Rico. Presently, around $35 billion live every year in the form of payments to external investors. Needless to say, this is capital that is not reinvested in Puerto Rico, which leads to a fourth feature of the economy since 1900. Puerto Rico's dependent economy has never been able to provide sufficient employment for its workforce. At present, Puerto Rico has a 40% labor participation rate. The official unemployment rate is 12%. 5, given the lack of employment, considerable migration has been another aspect of Puerto Rican life since the early 20th century. High unemployment also conspires against higher wages, which deepens economic inequality and ensures high levels of poverty. This helps explain the 6th feature, which is the persistence of the wide gap in living standards between Puerto Rico and the United States mainland. Puerto Rico's per capita income is a third of the US figure. It's half of the per capita income in the poorest state. Around 45% of the people in Puerto Rico live under the US poverty level. Whatever material progress Puerto Rico has made over the last century, and that progress is undeniable, must be tempered by acknowledgement of these limitations and contradictions. And I wish to underline what I'm going to say now. All of these limitations and contradictions are not the result of restrictions of movement of capital or goods between Puerto Rico and the United States. They are, if anything, the result of free trade, of the unfettered movement of capital, not of restrictions to it. In other words, the dogmas of free trade are part of the problem and not the solution. We need a planned reconstruction of our economy with broadened public and cooperative sectors. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the proposals emanating at present from the Puerto Rico government, the Federal Fiscal Control Board, or Congress for that matter. To orient our resistance to the punitive neoliberal agenda, we have presented a program that in general terms includes 1, audit annul the illegitimate portion and renegotiate the remainder of the debt with 3 priorities: protecting pensions, essential public services, and retaining resources required for economic renewal. 2, adopting an economic reconstruction plan centered on reinvesting profits generated in the island that must include a reconsideration of the existing tax exemption policies. 3, democratically reforming the public sector with active labor participation and citizen participation. 4, self-initiating a process of decolonization and self-determination through a constitutional status convention. And 5, obtaining a sizable funding from Congress for Puerto Rico's economic reconstruction, as well as action for Puerto Rico's decolonization. Are these goals attainable? Yes, but only through consistent and growing mobilization on the island and of our allies in the US mainland. Is it possible to find such allies beyond Puerto Rico? Yes, however, only, I believe, to the extent that the alliance is based not only on sympathy for Puerto Rico, which is important, but is not sufficient, not only based on sympathy for Puerto Rico, but also on a shared agenda of resistance against policies that affect working and poor people in the United States as well. Working and poor people in the United States today face the impact of several decades of neoliberal, corporate, tax, fiscal, social, and economic policies. As much as we in Puerto Rico, they need a vast program of economic reconstruction geared towards the creation of jobs and the satisfaction of basic social needs. We in Puerto Rico must connect with all movements pointing in that direction. The fact that these movements are still minority forces both in the United States and Puerto Rico makes it all the more urgent that those seeking to build them join forces and collaborate as effectively as possible. Thank you.
Questions from the floor addressing either Maria de Lourdes or Rafael? Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Jesus Alvarado. I'm a former PhD student here at UMass, microbiologist, pro-independence movement. My question is, today, Jeff Sessions, the Secretary of Justice, included the Estado Libre Asociado in the plebiscite. There's a lot of uproar right now in the island, and my question is that right now, there's a good, thank you. Right now, I think there's a good ground in order to push forward independence. My question is, what type of strategies in terms of communications could you guys use in order to use the independence or educate people of the benefits of independence? I was the former scientific advisor for a previous governor candidate, David Bernier. And one thing that I learned in this past election was that there was a lack of use of social media for a lot of candidates. And I believe that it's a very strong method to educate people, very accessible. And I just want to hear from you guys, what will be your strategies to use social media to educate people about the benefits of independence? Thank you.
Well, going beyond the question of the plebiscite that we have right now, I think that if we want to build a movement for independence and for social transformation in Puerto Rico, I think the first thing we have to build is the confidence of people that they can change things. One of the things that I found, this is changing now, fortunately, but in the beginning, when the board, the junta was organized and so on, you would be surprised, and not pleasantly, of the many people who supported the creation of the junta. And you have to ask yourself, why do they support the creation of this junta, at least initially? And my perspective was that they did so as a concept, a combination of two things. One of them is a very healthy one, which I also share, which is they are very upset at the government of Puerto Rico. They consider the government of Puerto Rico and the ruling parties have completely mismanaged the government, the island, and the economy for many years. They think that they are a bunch of corrupt officials, which is correct, and they think that Puerto Rico needs a very profound and radical change. But this notion, which is very healthy, is combined with a very heavy notion of impotence. We need change, but we cannot do it. We cannot transform things. So therefore, if you need change and you cannot do it, then somebody else has to do it. And, the junta or whoever has, an angel from heaven has to come down and fix things, because you cannot do it. So if we want to build a movement for independence and for social transformation, we have to start building that confidence in people that they can actually bring about the change that they want. And you do that not from one day to the next. You do that by mobilization, by activism, and so on. That's why I think that things such as the struggle in the University of Puerto Rico are very important because they built that capacity for change. My friend Emilio was asking in the previous panel, what is the outcome of these struggles? My answer would be, we don't know yet, because the struggle is still going on. All of these are small battles leading in one direction. The final thing that I say, because probably Maria de Lourdes wants to say something about this too, is that we are building from a very difficult situation in Puerto Rico. Perhaps because of my socialist and Marxist affiliations. For me, for example, the situation of the labor movement is very important. The situation of the working class is still very important. What we have lived in Puerto Rico in the last 20 years is the destruction of a considerable part of the working class. We have 1/2 of the manufacturing employment we had 20 years ago. Literally, the working class was swept away. It's not there anymore. And many people do not have the experience of working with other people in relatively large collective enterprises. So the notion that you can organize collectively to change things is not there. And the labor movement, which remains, it still exists, it's still important, is much weakened. So the notion that we can change things is something that we have to build. And fortunately, I think that resistance to the junta, resistance to the things that a junta is doing, are pointing in that direction. In February 9th, we have a very significant march in San Juan. Many people, there were probably about 10,000 people in that activity. Then we had a very big, surprisingly large activity on March 8th on International Women's Day, which was in the Villa de Oro, the place where all the big banks are located. And after that, we've had other very important mobilizations that indicate that after a period of relative demobilization, people are again, willing to consider other actions, besides all the other more local initiatives that are going on. So I think we have to build from there.
Thank you.
First, Jeff Sessions cannot change the ballot. His approval was needed in order to make use of the $2.5 million the Obama administration had assigned for the education campaign for the plebiscite. So now it's up to the governor and the legislature to change the terms of the plebiscite. I hope they will resist. Politically, that's the only way they can go. And I expect this to make people really mad at the United States. Because this kind of intervention, particularly after in 2012, people rejected the territorial status. It's completely inappropriate. You were asking how can we evolve in the independence movement? Well, that's the question we've been trying.
How can you, Dr. Bernabe explained very beautifully how people are able to organize, but in terms of somebody that I'm young, I'm 31 years old. In Puerto Rico, there's a lot of people that they stick to radio. The radio is very conservative, however, the social media has a lot of influence. And during this
You're on Facebook Live right now.
Yeah. However, things in social media are more complicated. And Facebook Live, Periscope, you need like a whole movement in the social media and in the streets. And I completely understand.
And we can agree on that, but there's something, last night we were talking about this. A couple of days ago, Joseph Stiglitz,
Yes.
Nobel Prize, he addressed a very large audience, 1,000 people. And he said that the draconian measures imposed by the Fiscal Control Board will hurt the economy and would target the most vulnerable people, and that made the headlines. We weren't that successful, saying the same things. Some things, let's put it, must be said in English.
I agree.
Because people need to hear from the United States, from people here in the United States. That's why we insist that in order to make acceptable to most people the idea of independence or free association, we need action from Congress. But nothing will happen in Congress if we don't act before, and that's for us. It's what the plebiscite is about. It's our way of saying, hey, this has to stop. We want to change our relation with the United States.
See, very rapidly, it's very terrible to be between you and dinner. And so I will very bad position to be in, so I will speak very briefly. Addressing your question, I think that what just happened with Jeff, perhaps some people are wondering what is all this discussion about Jeff Sessions and so on. There's going to be a plebiscite in Puerto Rico in June. We can debate whether it's going to solve anything or not, but it's going to be a plebiscite. And the plebiscite has two options in it right now. The ballot has two options: statehood and another option, doesn't have a name, which includes two options: independence and free association with the United States. So you can vote for one or the other two. If the other two win, then there's going to be another plebiscite to decide between those two. The present status, the ELA status, the Commonwealth status, is not in the ballot, and therefore the defenders of it were struggling, to have it included. It so happens that there is a previous federal legislation which says that they will provide $2 million, is it? $2.5 million for the government of Puerto Rico to carry out a plebiscite that includes constitutional options within it. So the Secretary of Justice of the U.S. has to decide whether this plebiscite is valid or not in that sense. So he just issued an opinion that he thinks that the present status should be included as a third option. And this is what the debate is all about. Now, whether they include it or not, I don't think, my personal perspective, and whether you tactically decide to vote in it or not, it's another issue altogether again. I think we should vote in the plebiscite, and I think we should vote for independence. But I personally don't think it's going to solve much, whether they include it or not. It's just like the one in 2012 didn't solve much. And that underlies the importance of point 4 in my presentation about our brief immediate program, which is that we have to self-initiate a process of decolonization. We should organize a Puerto Rican Constitutional Convention, or whichever convention we want to organize, to start a process of self-determination. Not wait for Congress to do this. Confront Congress with our action in that direction. The other point I want to make very briefly, and it's basically posing a problem, not giving an answer, is that, and I include myself in this because I'm a defender of independence, sometimes I hear us who are in favor of independence of Puerto Rico speaking, and we are so sure of the rightness of this option and this perspective, which I think we should be, because I think it's the correct path for Puerto Rico, that we forget that at present, the vast majority of the people in Puerto Rico do not support independence. So our first question has to be, beyond affirming our belief in this notion, is how do we get them from where they are now to the position where we want them to be. Exactly. And I insist that this is not going to happen from one day to the next, and there are going to be many avenues in that direction. I think the Independence Party plays a fundamental role because it affirms, as Maria de Lourdes did so very eloquently a few minutes ago, the need for independence. The party to which I belong has a sort of, at least I have a different take within that party, which is that we want to bring people out of the traditional parties. We want to bring them to an anti-neoliberal agenda, We want to bring them to a struggle against the junta, but not necessarily defining our struggle initially as a struggle for independence. In our party, there are people who are for statehood. We had candidates who are stateholders, but they are against neoliberalism, and they are against Promesa, they are against Donald Trump. So they want Puerto Rico to be part of the United States, but they don't want these policies that are dominant in the United States. And we think at this moment it's important to try to work with these people. Even if I am an independentista socialist. Somebody is, well, most of the people who are in the Working People's Party in Puerto Rico who are stakeholders, as you would suspect, were supporters or sympathized with the Sanders campaign. But the point is that we are trying to create movements in which people who do not necessarily identify as independentistas are also welcome, because they are equally worried about pensions employment and the crisis of the debt and austerity policies and so on.
And maybe eventually they'll see that having
Absolutely.
you know, we can
They will see that we are not monsters that are going to.
Real quickly, I wanted to make a quick point.
We have, Maria de Lourdes is going
Maria
to
de
talk,
Lourdes,
and we are
and
going to.
tomorrow we're gonna gather again. Yeah.
Please.
Very briefly. No electoral event will change reality by itself. It's going to be a very long process, but it's a very important point to start with.
Can I say really quickly, though, that part of the problem is that Americans are controlling the narrative of what's happening with these plebiscites. You had mentioned that 54% rejected, right, statehood or the territorial status. However, Americans here, and if you read up on the literature, the most current literature, they have translated that to mean that Puerto Ricans are rejecting independence and are in favor of statehood. And that has been the narrative here in the United States, and I fight that narrative all the time as far as education. So as long as our Americans in diaspora are perpetuating that idea, that's going to be the continual problem and one of the major obstacles to the road to independence.
We are short on time to explain that, but there were two questions in the 2012 ballots, and that's what our vote is. As to the previous question, colonialism and neoliberalism are so closely, how's the word, intertwined? Intertwined. Nothing is going to change in the economic system unless we change our political situation. Because the United States rules, that's it. What we want, and I think previously one of the other panels, the issue was addressed, we want to change Puerto Rico because, hey, it's a moral imperative. We must rule in our country. It's just wrong to be ruled by a foreign country. But we also want to change the economic reality. We want to change the relations of power. But that is not going to happen under the current status. That's not going to happen under statehood. And reality is the best proof of it.
Thank you.
Father, we will continue tomorrow.